Greetings, everyone. I'm diving into the questions and key takeaways from our recent Bible study session. Most recently, we continued our journey through the book of Romans, covering chapter 9, verses 14 through 24. All right, let's dive deeper. Pause the video. When you finish reading the passage, Romans chapter 9, verses 14 through 16, press the play button to continue the video. Welcome back. Now, let's consider this question. What is and is not the basis for salvation? Let's delve into the summary of this question. When we stand at the threshold of Romans chapter 9, we encounter a passage that pulls back the curtain on the very machinery of God's sovereignty. Specifically in verses 14 through 16, it begins with a staggering question that many of us have whispered in our own hearts. Is God unjust? Paul anticipates our human protest against a selection process that doesn't seem to follow our rules of fairness. And his answer is a resounding quote, by no means, unquote. This leads us to the first and perhaps most foundational description of what salvation is built upon, which is the absolute and sovereign prerogative of God's mercy. Paul anchors this argument by quoting the words spoken to Moses, where God declares that he will have mercy on whom he has mercy and compassion on whom he has compassion. This reveals that the basis for salvation is not a reaction from God to something we have done, but rather a proactive overflow of his character. It is an internal decision within the Godhead, uncoerced by outside influence, which ensures that grace remains truly, quote, grace, unquote, rather than a debt owed. While it is vital to understand that mercy is the fuel of salvation, Paul is equally concerned with dismantling our misconceptions about what does not trigger that mercy. He pivots seamlessly to explain that salvation is not a result of human will or, quote, the one who wills, unquote. This is a difficult pill for the modern ego to swallow because we live in a culture that prizes, quote, the self-made man, unquote, and the power of personal choice. However, the text is clear that our internal desires, our sincere, quote, wanting, unquote, to be saved, or our intellectual assent are not the root causes of our standing before God. Beyond the internal will, Paul expands his scope to include external effort, stating that salvation is also not for, quote, the one who runs, unquote. This second negative description addresses the, quote, doers, unquote, those who believe their spiritual stamina, moral performance, or religious activity can bridge the gap between the creature and the creator. If our, quote, running, unquote, or our spiritual hustle were the basis for our salvation, then the finish line would be a paycheck for services rendered rather than a gift received. These verses culminate in a profound theological reality where the only thing left standing is the grace of a holy God. The teachable takeaway for the modern church is that we must move away from a, quote, transactional gospel, unquote, that treats God like a vending machine for our efforts. We are called to be a people who find our security not in the strength of our own grip on God, but in the unwavering strength of his grip on us. When we realize that salvation is grounded entirely in his mercy, it doesn't lead to passivity. It leads to a deep, humble relationship that is finally free from the exhausting need to prove our worth. Let's now shift our focus to Romans chapter 9, verses 17 through 21. Pause the video. When you finish reading the passage, Romans chapter 9, verses 17 through 21, press the play button to continue the video. Welcome back. Now, let's explore this key question. How can we answer the objection that it is not just for God to elect some and not others? Let's delve into the summary of this question. When we step into the heavy atmosphere of Romans chapter 9, verses 17 to 21, we find ourselves standing before one of the most intellectually and spiritually demanding corridors of the New Testament. The Apostle Paul anticipates the natural human outcry that arises when we hear of God's absolute sovereignty. If God chooses who he hardens and who he has mercy upon, how can we still find fault this in us? This tension is not just an ancient theological puzzle, but a raw, modern question about the very nature of justice. The first way we can address this objection of unfairness is by shifting our perspective from human rights to divine rights, specifically through the lens of God's purposeful history. Paul brings up Pharaoh, not as a victim of a cosmic whim, but as a vessel through which the power and name of God would be proclaimed throughout the entire earth. This suggests that God's justice is not a reactive force governed by human expectations of equality, but a proactive design intended to maximize his glory across the timeline of the universe. When we realize that, quote, justice, unquote, we demand, is often just a request for God to act according to our limited script, we begin to see that his prerogative to use specific individuals for specific historical ends is an expression of a much higher, more complex order of righteousness. Building upon the foundation of God's historical purpose, we find a second impactful answer to the reality of our shared human condition. The objection that is, quote, unjust, unquote, for God to elect some usually carries the silent assumption that we all deserve to be chosen. However, the biblical narrative operates on the premise that if God were to give everyone exact cold justice, no one would stand, since the entire, quote, lump, unquote, of clay is already fallen. The fact that God chooses to save any at all is an act of staggering mercy rather than a violation of rights. Justice would be the condemnation of all. Therefore, mercy shown to some does not constitute an injustice to the rest, but rather an unmerited gift that highlights his grace. This leads us directly into the third and perhaps most humbling response, which is the fundamental distinction between the creator and the created. Paul uses the striking imagery of the potter and the clay to remind us of our, quote, creaturely, unquote, status, asking if the thing molded has the right to interrogate the one who molded it. This isn't a divine, quote, shut up and deal with it, unquote, but rather a recalibration of our intellectual humility. Impactful justice requires an absolute knowledge of every heart, every consequence, and every end, a level of data that only the Creator possesses. By acknowledging that the potter has authority over the clay to make one vessel for honorable use and another for common use, we admit that God's justice is tied to his ownership of the universe, an authority that far supersedes our localized definitions of, quote, fair, unquote. As we consider how these profound truths translate to the life of the modern church, we arrive at a vital teachable takeaway. The doctrine of election and God's sovereign choice is never meant to make the church a gated community of the elite, but rather a humble assembly of the, quote, mercy receivers. For the contemporary believer, understanding that our standing is based entirely on God's purpose and not on our own effort should destroy all spiritual pride and fuel a desperate, outward-facing mission. Our takeaway is this: because God is the sovereign potter, our confidence rests in his power to save the, quote, unsavable, unquote. And our mandate is to reflect that same unmerited mercy to a world that desperately needs to know a God who is both infinitely just and incomprehensibly kind. Let's shift our focus now. Pause the video. When you finish reading the passage, Romans chapter 9, verses 22 through 24, press the play button to continue the video. Welcome back. Now, let's consider this question. Why did Paul include these chapters on the nation of Israel? Let's delve into the summary. In the sweeping narrative of the book of Romans, Paul pauses his theological treatise on salvation to address a heavy, lingering question. What about Israel? As we step into the profound depths of chapter 9, specifically verses 22 through 24, we encounter a Paul who is not merely theorizing, but is defending the very character of God. The first and perhaps most significant reason Paul includes this discourse is to demonstrate that God's sovereign choice is anchored in his long-suffering patience. Paul asks if God, desiring to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with much long-suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, By focusing on the nation of Israel's hardening, Paul illustrates that God is not a volatile deity reacting in the moment, but a purposeful creator who uses even rebellion to provide a window of time for his ultimate plan to unfold. This theme of divine patience leads us directly into the second reason for this passage, which is the revelation of the quote, riches of his glory, unquote. Paul explains that this endurance was intended to make known the wealth of his grace upon the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory. By contrasting the quote, vessels of wrath, unquote, with the quote, vessels of mercy, unquote, Paul highlights that Israel's temporary stumbling was the catalyst for a global display of God's kindness. He wanted the world to see that his glory isn't just found in his power to judge, but more vibrantly in his power to redeem what was lost. Without the context of Israel's specific history and their rejection of the Messiah, the sheer magnitude of God's mercy toward the rest of humanity would lack its dramatic and historical weight. Building upon this display of glory, Paul concludes this section by clarifying the inclusive nature of God's call, which serves as the third vital reason for this chapter. He specifies that these vessels of mercy are, quote, us whom he called, and not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles, unquote. Paul includes this chapter to dismantle any lingering idea that God's covenant was restricted by DNA or national borders. By showing that Israel's history was always leading toward this, quote, calling, unquote, Paul validates the Gentile mission as the fulfillment of God's ancient promises rather than a backup plan. This pivot ensures that the Roman Church and every believer since understands that being, quote, God's people, unquote, is a status granted by his call, not by our heritage. Reflecting on these verses provides a powerful teachable takeaway for the modern church. We must never mistake God's patience for passivity or his sovereignty for exclusion. The modern believer is reminded that our inclusion in the family of God is a gift of, quote, vessels of mercy, unquote, status meant to provoke us to humility rather than pride. Just as Paul sought to explain Israel's place to keep the church from becoming conceited, we are called to recognize that our position in Christ is a result of a global, historical, and sovereign move of God that welcomes the outsider. It's been a joy to study God's word with you, and I look forward to continuing our journey together next week. We'll be picking up our study in the book of Romans. The lesson plan for next week's class will be sent to your inbox Monday morning, so please keep an eye out for that email. If you aren't currently receiving our email or would like to be added to the distribution list, please reach out via the Antioch Fairfax State, Virginia website at antioch-church.org. You can also find the class facilitator's email address in the video description below. Until then, grace and peace be with you.